I like to joke that in all the work that I've done, both as a chaplain and working in the first responder world, and then my work within the task force, I should have a PhD in this stuff. Like I should have a PhD in death and dying and grief and loss. Like I feel like I like knew it all, right? And so I thought I knew what I was talking about, and I thought I was doing a pretty good job about it. I realized I was not doing as great of a job educating people on grief until these last couple of years.
Command, Engine 10, first line attack, making entry.
Wendy, welcome back. We appreciate you being here for a second hour and talking with us a little bit more. And for our viewers out that are watching this, I'd just like to say that we had Wendy on for episode 1, and if you haven't had the opportunity to check it out, it would be a really great opportunity. And I do feel like that discussion kind of feeds into this one. They're definitely both stories in and of themselves, and they're very important. But I think that if you reflect back on that one, if you're not if you don't know Wendy as well as some other people might, then I think it'll help tell that whole story. So again, Wendy, thanks for being with us, and I know that this is a tough story on so many levels. I I can't even imagine.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine going through what you did, like we discussed in the previous episode, in regards to your injury, founding the task force, and just your recovery from that injury was pretty spectacular. That the likelihood of a recovery like you've had was not foreseen apparently by the medical field.
You have a message the world needs to hear, but you're not sure where to start. At Bella Media, we make podcasting easy. Our studio is open Monday through Friday, starting at just $100. You bring the story, we provide the space. Let's get your voice out there. Email us at info@bellamedia.com to book your session today. That's info@bellamedia.com.
To recover from that and then go through the loss of a loved one, through the line of duty death of your husband, John.
Correct.
And so I can't tell you how appreciative I am of you having that public conversation. But I do believe personally that God makes us go through things for a reason.
Absolutely.
And I think it'll help a lot of people.
Sure.
So with that, I'm just going to leave it with you. And I'm just going to let you do your thing and tell us kind of the story of how all that started and how all that happened.
Thank you for having me back again for the second hour. I'm grateful for that. And of course, you and I talked a little bit off air as far as telling stories and being able to share our experiences. And I certainly believe after 25 years of doing this work and working so intimately with firefighters and other first responders and families that have been through tragedy and trauma, that a big part of our healing and finding meaning in the difficult things that we endure comes from our ability to tell stories and be able to get our story specifically out there. The more that we talk about it, the more that we share it, the easier it is for us to be able to process those things that we've been through. And that's why it's so important when we go through a tragic incident where chaplaincy comes into play, where you can talk one-on-one with a chaplain, or if the department is involved with critical incident stress management and doing debriefings in a group setting. I know that's not always for everyone, that some individuals like to talk one-on-one, and that's where peer support happens. And so just being able to share your story is so healing and is so important with our ability to continue doing this work and doing it in a healthy and well way. And so having that support system and that structure and being able to share what we've been through is so crucial, not only for our own healing, but also to be able to help somebody else as well, because other people are going through things and maybe their stories are not exactly the same. But there may be some sort of life lesson or lesson that you've learned in your own particular story that could be helpful to somebody else or help them find a sense of comfort. And, I have a verse that I wanted to share. I'm not really great at memorizing. I like to blame all of that on the brain injury that I talked about earlier in my story. But I really truly believe in the Second Corinthians 1, where it says he comforts us every time we have trouble. So when others have trouble, we can comfort them with the same comfort God gives us. And I think that is really the foundation principle of our organization with the Line of Duty Death Task Force and my work as a chaplain as well. And that's how I got my foot back in the door with the fire service, because I for sure knew that I was not going to take no for an answer, and I was not going to let that doctor dictate what I was going to do with my life and staying in the fire service. And so I had to figure that out, and that's where the task force was really born. But I still really grieved the loss of who I was as a firefighter and being able to go into situations where I could make a difference and create some calm from the chaos. I wanted to still do the work. And part of that was starting the organization. The other part of it was going through chaplaincy training through the Federation of Fire Chaplains. I became a master certified chaplain after several years of study and being a part of a fire department. I was blessed enough to be brought onto Forest Bend Fire Department, which is a small volunteer fire department in the unincorporated county of Harris. We're at the most southeast part of Harris County here in the Houston.
You've been there a while, right? How
Yes,
many
since
years?
2005.
Okay, wow.
Yeah, so
Cool.
almost 20 years, with a little break in between when we adopted our daughter. But my husband was also a part of that. So I was still able to keep my foot in the door and do pretty much everything that I could do before, except go into IDLH environments. And I know myself well enough to take myself out of positions where I feel like I could be a danger to others or to myself. And so I get to still play in the fire service pretty extensively. And that allows me to keep that connection with what's happening day to day, what's happening now within
That's
the fire
good.
service. Yeah,
Kind of helps keep us grounded.
yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely. And so God's given me that opportunity to keep my foot in the door of the fire service world. Um, but a big piece of what we do with one another in this work is supporting one another. It's a big part of our social structure.
Hmm.
Again, like what I was talking about with the retirement piece, is you losing your identity when you retire out of this career field
Hmm.
or this profession per se, and what that looks like and who I am. And so we've got to be able to rebuild our lives and restructure our lives in such a way that we figure out what our sense of purpose is, and um, who is it that we can serve? How can we be better, do better, all of those things. And so over the years, I have strived to figure out what does the task force mean? Like, here we are 25 years later or 20 years later. What does our service look like to others? And that's where we expand into mental health care for fellow firefighters or first responders that come to us seeking resources or referrals. We've started doing a lot more of that lately. And then, because of the West explosion, we have been brought into other incidents where I firmly believe that God has placed me into these situations where I was exposed to mass fatality incidents. So our organization has been a part of every mass shooting here in the state of Texas, except for Sutherland Springs. So we played a huge part in ensuring that our first responders that were deployed out to assist with those incidents were being taken care of on the mental health and spiritual side of things. And so my work not only evolved into ensuring that we were connecting agencies and families to resources, whatever that looked like, whether or not that was a line of duty death or a line of duty injury, if it was a first responder that was needing the mental health support, or now looking at this mass casualty disaster response is really big, going through Harvey and our ice storm. We are impacted in so many different ways. And so we saw our organization really expand as far as providing those resources and the recovery piece. But what I have found over those years is that Grief is a huge part of who we are as individuals working in this profession, not just on the line of duty death task force, because we are dealing with people who have gone through significant loss, whatever that looks like. But when we go out onto the streets and we're providing EMS to somebody that we're having to do CPR on, where there's a life that's been lost, um, whether or not we are on a fire and we've seen the total devastation of a home that's been burned to the ground, and we're witnessing the family's grief. Grief is a big part of our work, and it's
It
part
is.
of who we are. And we are going to be faced with death in our job and personally, and probably sometime in our profession. Again, whether or not that be a line of duty death, a suicide, or off duty, we are going to be faced with death, dying, and grief and loss and all of that. And it's my experience in studying grief is that our culture, the Western culture, especially here in the United States, does not handle grief well at
You're right.
all.
We don't.
It's hard. It's hard to face people that are struggling through that loss. We don't know what to say. We often don't know what to do except for giving them casseroles. And so I like to call it the three C's. We warn our families all the time that be prepared to get a flood of cash, casseroles, and cards. And sure
It's
enough, every
true.
single time. And that's the way
Hmm.
we know how to deal with grief. And then when we talk about our line of duty deaths or our deaths in general, um, we want to be able to give them all the things, everything, full honors. The fire service knows how to do a funeral pretty well. I think we can
Hmm.
do a great one. And almost to the extent where we've become so good at it, just I think because of the resources that we have nowadays. I can tell you that 20 years ago, it was a lot of support that we were guiding these agencies that had losses. We were bringing in honor guard teams to teach them how to do this. And now you can get on YouTube University.
Yeah.
But I think we have sanitized our funerals down so much that we don't even really know the traditions behind what we're doing and why we're doing it. We can put up a crossed aerial, the flag, do the bells, but do we actually
What does it mean?
really know?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's the first part of this grief and understanding how to process grief is the meaning behind things and making meaning when loss occurs. But because we've sanitized loss so well and not wanting to deal with it or not knowing how to deal with it, we just tend to get through it very quickly and push it aside and move on to the next thing. And so we'll spend a week putting together a funeral for our coworker, and it's great and big, and we do all the things and we hustle and we bustle, and then we have what's called the Tuesday morning effect
Hmm.
that one of our families has lovingly labeled.
Hmm.
And it's for that whole week or 2 weeks, whatever that may look like. You are bombarded by individuals that are wanting to help you. They're wanting to provide services to you. You're at everybody's beck and call. Whatever you need, just tell us what you need. And then once the person has been buried, it's gone. Everything's gone. They may check up on you for a while, but then it goes away. And the same is true for our own experiences when we have lost something, whether it be our own family member or loss of a dream or loss, whatever that loss looks like. It doesn't necessarily have to be a death per se, but a loss of some sort. We kind of pat each other on the back. We will go through it with them for a couple of days, and then it's like, I'm over it. I'm done talking about it. I'm ready to move on to the next thing. And so I don't think our culture processes it
Yeah,
well.
that's what I was going to ask to see if you
Mhm.
kind of felt like there was a correlation. I think in the last episode we discussed a little bit about the social push to
Mhm.
move past things, whether you're ready to or not.
You're
You know what I
right.
mean?
Right.
And so it sounds like there's some correlation to be had there.
We talk a lot about stigma and reducing stigma within the first responder world. We want to be open about talking about post traumatic stress. That's the label for everything. If you're having a bad day, oh, it's probably some,
PTSD.
yeah, PTSD. It automatically
Yeah.
PTSD. It's automatically we have that disorder piece of it. And I know a lot of people don't like that, but currently that's what it's called professionally. But that's what we tend to label it when there could be many more aspects in the life of this person that's impacting them that has nothing to do with post-traumatic stress. It's probably related somehow to loss. And when we don't process out our grief very well, that can exacerbate other behavioral health responses that we may have. It could exacerbate the traumatic stress that we endure. But when we talk about stigma and trying to reduce stigma, that means that we have to be in it for as long as a person needs to be in it without it becoming complicated or without it becoming damaging to the other person. Because for sure, we don't want to have compassion fatigue. We don't want to cause vicarious trauma. That does not mean that we need to jump like feet first all the way up to the neck deep into what that person is experiencing, but we can't ask them to get rid of it quickly. We can't just say
Yeah.
it's time to move on.
Mhm.
Instead, we still walk beside them and offer guidance, offer support, offer resources, offer the ability to talk with them, or here's somebody else that you can talk with them. But reducing stigma also means that people process out their pain in different time frames. And so we can't truly tell people that we are working on this as an industry when we don't address some of the things that we still are getting wrong or we're not doing correctly.
Mhm.
And I think the grief component is a big piece of that. And so pretty early on, I started doing a lot more work in the grief aspect of things because if I was going to work with fallen families, I needed to understand the grief element. And it was taught a little bit in the chaplaincy, but not a whole lot. And then I learned about a certification program by a gentleman who worked under Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, which is a name that may sound familiar to some of your listeners. She is the one that came up with what is called the stages of grief, which is a complete misnomer. So,
Okay.
um,
I think it's still written in some textbooks.
yes.
Hmm.
And when she wrote the stages of grief, she was talking about the grief that cancer patients or terminal patients are
Okay.
going through. So it's not the person that has endured the loss, it's the person that knows they are going to die and their stages of coming to terms with their own death. And so those stages of grief are for the living, the person that is actively dying. And it's not for the person that's grieving the loss of that said person.
Gotcha.
And so it always frustrates me when they're like, oh, it's the stages of grief. I'm like, but it's not for you.
So
It's,
that was the source of that particular study that grew
yeah,
into that being cited in textbooks was,
yeah.
so it sounds like their sample group was specifically people that were terminal.
Yeah, that were dying.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
So it wasn't necessarily for other people.
right.
It was for an individual that was facing death themselves.
Yes, absolutely. Because, it does make sense. In a lot of those steps, the person who is grieving a loss of somebody else or something else can go through and have similar feelings that are in those stages. But I think that we've drilled so hard down into, okay, you are now in the sad phase. Now you're in the angry phase. Okay, we got to move on to this next phase. And if you're not moving along fast enough, you're not doing it right, or I can't handle you anymore. And so this misnomer that these steps are what people are supposed to go through when they've been through loss is completely wrong.
Okay.
And so the individual, his name is David Kessler. He is a clinician and did training underneath of her and offers grief certification, grief education. So I'm a certified grief educator
Okay.
and learned a lot through that program,
Wow.
especially. And he lost his own son
Goodness.
to drug overdose. And so he tells his story and whatnot. So
Mhm.
I like to joke that in all the work that I've done, both as a chaplain and
Mhm.
working in the first responder world, and then my work within the task force, I should have a PhD in this stuff. Like I should have a PhD in death and dying and grief and loss. Like I feel like I like knew it all, right?
Mhm.
And so I thought I knew what I was talking about, and I thought I was doing a pretty good job about it. I realized I was not doing as great of a job educating people on grief until these these last couple of years when I was going to these conferences, and the big topic is mental health,
Yeah.
and people are sharing their stories, and that's great, but what do we do after? Like, what is it that we do? What now? What's next?
Right.
So I've contemplated a lot about grieving and loss and looking at first responders and ones that are really struggling mentally. Is what else? What components are missing? We're just talking about post-traumatic stress, but what else is there? And when you start doing some digging and when you really sit down to talk with these individuals, a lot of times you will find grief as the underlying source for that person. And it could go back to childhood. It could go back to a loss that they endured with a parent or a divorce. It could be a loss or grief that they've experienced on the job and they just didn't realize how much that impacted them. So, for example, a few weeks ago, our fire department had a pretty massive fire. And thankfully, the occupants were able to get out of the home, but their animals did not. And they lost a total of nine dogs and cats. And they were brought outside and, laid out there on the grass. And the family was very emotional. They were very, very emotional, almost shocking to me in some aspects, and dealing with a lot of people that have been through loss of all types. And it caused a lot of distress with our firefighters, and seeing that and having
To see
to,
how upset they were.
yeah, to see
Yeah.
how upset they were and how really kind of hands on they were with these animals. And so that's something that, again, we can correlate back to our own lives. And so if you deal with a child, the death of a child, and then you have your own child at home, or you see nine dead animals outside of a fire and you realize you have two dogs that look exactly the same, you can imagine what that loss and that grief looks like. But yeah, we don't talk about that. We may
Hmm.
talk about the trauma of seeing that, but we don't get down to the nitty gritty of grief because nobody likes to talk about grief. We
Hmm.
just want to move on. We can talk about trauma all day long. We've gotten great talking about post traumatic stress all day long, but we don't talk about grief, and we don't talk about the anger that can result from unprocessed or complicated grief. We don't talk about depression and anxiety that can get wrapped up with loss and grief and whatnot. We're a little better about that. So I kind of had made it my mission to learn as much as I can about grief and what that does to first responders and how we could teach this better. Like, what is it that we can do? What I didn't realize was what was coming down the road for me personally, which is definitely ironic. But November 25th of last year, which was Small Business Saturday, we always like to say there's Thanksgiving, Black Friday, and Small Business Saturday. It was right in the middle of the night. So I claim Black Friday, but it really happened early Saturday morning. We had a mutual aid structure fire that was quite large. And my husband, who had retired from the Houston Fire Department just a year prior, had taken on the position as fire chief for the Forest Bend Fire Department. He had been the assistant fire chief for a long period of time and their safety officer for many years. And he was the type that had to be very hands-on. And there was a joke that irritated him to no end, where there's a couple of firefighters that are down in our area. They're Houston guys, but they're also involved with some of the volunteer fire departments, and they work day crew for our department, where they fully believe that the fire chief or the person in command of that incident sits in their vehicle and stays in their vehicle, and that's it. Like, you do not leave your vehicle. You roll the window up and you stay there. And he was having none of that. He did not want any part of that. And so they always gave him a hard time about that. He wanted to be with his guys. Even if it was just standing outside, he wouldn't go interior unless there was another chief that was there running it. But he wanted to be out there hands on with his guys, teaching them what they needed to do. He was a big instructor,
To be involved. And
had to be involved. And even being a little overweight and not the best eater like most of us are, he could run circles around these younger guys. Like it always blew them away. I mean, he had a belly, and we would do these trainings where it was trying to get through the tunnels and you get snared up, and the walls are a little short, and you got to figure out how to get your air pack. No one would, especially the younger ones, they would come in and they were like, that guy can't smash himself through that thing. And he sure enough did. He could fit his fat belly through that thing with his air pack on. He took great pride in that. But he could run circles around them. So he was very much an educator. He was very much a hands on person. He wanted to see with his own eyes what was happening. And so, even though with Houston, he worked at Hobby Airport, and so they didn't see as much as far as making calls and runs. He got that when he was with Forrest Bend. And so, that
Was
was
he
that.
aircraft rescue?
Yes,
Okay,
ARF.
ARF. I gotcha.
Yeah. So we would joke around too, is like that was the retirement station. They could Netflix binge and do all the
All the
things.
jokes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
all of that. COVID was great. They really had their element. Um, so when we had calls, he wanted to be on calls. And when he was with Houston, he was one of the city's most renowned paramedics at the time, with a group of them. A long time ago, Houston Fire Department was actually one of the departments that would test out new procedures, new ways of treating patients. The physician back then wanted to bring all of the research that had to do with EMS to his department. And so they became world renowned with some of the things that they were doing out on the
I
streets. And he
remember
was,
some of those studies.
yeah. So he was a part of that. So he was a renowned paramedic. And so when he had the opportunities to do things on the streets for Forrest Bend, he was out there doing it, including that night. He was out there dragging hose and following things around and making sure they were doing the right thing. And it was the middle of the night. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning. Thankfully, again, I believe God ordained, my daughter, who was 16 at the time, had spent the night at her best friend's house. And so I typically don't make runs at night because even though she's a teenager, I like to be at home in the middle of the night in case anything happens. So I typically don't go on runs. But for whatever reason that night, I was sitting there laying in bed listening to the radio because I have my own radio being the chaplain, and I'm an incident command tech as well for them. And I thought, you know what? I'll just go. So I drove myself over there to the fire. It was a pretty massive fire. We probably had 50 firefighters on there, different mutual aid companies that had come in. We were providing mutual aid to the city next to us. And so what had happened was this fire was in a dilapidated home that was actually slated to be demolished the following Monday. And we believe that there were some kids that were in there that were either smoking or trying to light something on fire, and it caught the whole thing on fire. It was set back into a wooded area. I think the home may have been destroyed in Harvey because it was back there by the creek that we had. So when Friendswood made they were first in, they accidentally ran the engine off the side of the road because it was like you couldn't see it. It was so dark and back in the wooded area. So we weren't able to get to the pump panel to connect the hoses. And so Forest Bend being second in, we had to connect everything to our apparatus to be able to fight the fire. So we knew we were going to be on there because usually if you're not connected, you're like, yes, I can get out of there as soon
Yeah.
as possible. Nobody wants to do the like rolling hose,
Yeah, all the cleanup.
all the cleanup.
Uh-huh.
Worst part of the job. So we were out on that fire from like 1-ish to about 5 in the morning. So a good 4-hour fire. And I was following him around and he was running all over the place. He was hard to catch up with. And I'm his ICT. And so I had to take notes and do all the things. And it's hard following that guy. So to me, he was fine. I did not see anything wrong with him other than everybody was tired. It was the middle of the night and we're fighting fire at nighttime. So around 4:30-ish, there was really nothing left for me to do, and we were waiting for another fire engine from Friendswood to come in so we could just change out our hose and we could go ahead and go, because they were going to watch the fire for a few more hours. But for the most part, it was out. It was just hot spots. And so I decided to go ahead and leave and head back home. And so the protocol for us, and should be for every volunteer firefighter and any firefighter, is that when we got home from making a fire, is that you go on the back porch and you take your clothes off, and then you get in the shower and you decon. And that way you're not trying to bring in as many of the carcinogens as possible. And so that's what we do. So I came home, I did all of that, got into bed, and I was scrolling Instagram or Facebook or whatever, trying to kind of get myself to calm down a little bit, kind of come off of that high of
Yeah.
being on a fire.
Hmm.
And I could hear them talking, and then all of a sudden I heard my husband come over the radio and stating that he had been released from the call. And so I sent him a text and I said, "Hey, are you coming home or are you going up to the station to wash hose?" And he said, "No, I'm coming home. We're going to do that later in the morning." And so I said, "Okay." So I'm still laying in bed, and we were maybe 2 miles away. Our home was 2 miles away from where the fire was, and he had a take home vehicle being a chief. So I heard him come through the front door. I heard him go to the back porch, and then I heard him get into the shower. And then he got out of the shower pretty quickly because usually after a fire, we'll scrub down for a good 20 minutes, 15 minutes. But he seemed to get out of there fast. And the room was dark because it was still, early morning. And John was a drama queen.
Hmm.
He would get man flu like nobody's business. Like I said, he was a
I do it too.
world.
I do it
Okay,
too.
so you
I
understand.
understand.
He was a world-renowned medic that tested all of these things, but
Yeah.
heaven forbid he gets sick. He has no idea what to do. So, and he would get hurt easily, like fake hurt. I don't know. He was a lot.
Gotcha.
So he came around the corner of the bed, and we have two dogs. And I thought that maybe he had tripped over a dog bone that was laying at the corner of the bed, and he fell and was being dramatic. So I was a little annoyed. And so I called his name and he didn't answer. And I was like, well, that's weird. And so I called him again and he didn't answer. And I was like, okay, maybe he knocked himself out.
Mhm.
So I peered over the end of the bed and he was knocked out cold. And I was like, oh my gosh, like he literally hit his head.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating about the brain, and we talk about fight, flight, or freeze,
Hmm.
is that sometimes we really cannot take over what our brain goes into during a moment of stress or a moment of trauma. We do not have control. We have some control, but when our brain takes over in a certain type of moment, and you never know when that's going to happen, it takes over and there's not a lot you can do about it. And so for me, I became very focused on a neuro injury. He had a head injury. He had tripped on this dog bone, hit his head, and he had a brain bleed. I was not thinking of anything else all the way until they declared him. And so I could not get that out of my head, even being EMS, all of that. And so I, shook him and I was like, John. And then I was doing the sternal chest rub saying, John, are you okay? I did not even think to check for his pulse yet. I was just still in this injury piece.
Hmm.
And I had a radio as well. And so I got on the radio and I called for help. And so I readjusted his head and he let out an agonal respiration. And I didn't see it as that at the time. I thought it was, oh, his head was in a weird position and now he's finally able to breathe, but he was still not responding. And so then my brain said, check for a pulse. And I checked for a pulse and there was no pulse. And I was like, okay, well, now he killed himself falling on. So I'm like, I'm sorry I called you, a wimp, but okay. So I had to start doing, CPR on him and just went into that mode of first responder mode. It was no longer my husband, it was a fellow firefighter that, just collapsed. And so I was able to take myself out of that. And thankfully, the firefighters had just been backing into the station when they heard me over the radio, and they came in. So they were at the house within probably 5 minutes of when he collapsed. It happened again. That slow. It felt like it was slow, fast. But then they all started piling in, and they were coming from all of the mutual aid fire departments that had been on that fire were starting to show up because they all know him. They were all um, part of our department and worked with him on many other fire scenes. So my house was filled with firefighters. And thankfully, they did not chase me off because that's what we tend to do with our patients, right? With family, we want them away. We don't want them to see.
Yeah.
But they did not do that to me. And so that was also a blessing for me to be still a part of things, even if it was just to witness that. But that gave me the ability to step back and watch what was happening. Because in what I've learned with the families working with them over the years is that everything becomes a blur and they remember nothing. They don't really remember much from the funeral. They don't really remember much that happened after the death. It becomes like a blank part of their brain. And so, knowing that, I purposely stepped aside and was trying to take it all in
Hmm.
and really watch what was happening with my crews. I mean, these are my fellow crew members too
Yeah.
that are having to work on him. And so then I started making the phone calls to different people in my life that are most of my family is out of state, and so my chosen family, I like to call them, trying to get a hold of them and bringing them over. But so they worked on him probably at the house for a good 30 to 45 minutes, taking their time. They were really trying to see if they could get a pulse back. They were doing all the things. And then we finally moved him out into the ambulance. And again, thankfully, I was able to still see all of it from the perspective of a first responder. So, the Lucas can be really traumatizing for a family member to see, seeing intubation, seeing IVs that are put into bones can be very distressing and disturbing. And we try to prevent other family members from seeing that. And unfortunately, I did not do as good of a job with that with my best friend and her husband that came over, because for them that was their brother. Like we were so close, we had been friends for like 25 years. So as long as I
Wow.
had been married to John, pretty much we had been friends. And so, I had to kind of deal with that later on, with her own kind of trauma to witnessing that. But I was still in firefighter mode. And even though it was my husband, it was still a patient that we had to take care of. And so we brought him into the hospital and they worked on him for another 30 minutes. They did not kick me out of the trauma bay. The doctor brought out the Doppler, and I stood right beside him, and he was pointing everything out. And he said, "There's nothing we can do. There has to be something that's stuck in there." And so I was still thinking neuro this whole time. And so I actually ordered an autopsy, which could have been actually damaging for me if they had found anything else, because with firefighters who have cardiac, it's considered presumptive. And so if you do an autopsy and they find out something different, then that could potentially take away the line of duty death qualification and the benefits that kind of follow that.
Okay.
So they worked on him for about an hour, hour and a half. And all of a sudden, when I walked out of the hospital doors for just a minute, I couldn't believe all of the firefighters and people that had found out that were starting to show up. I've seen it happen in other places, doing the work, but never had I seen that, from the personal
Hmm.
perspective, because it's the
Yeah.
opposite experience that I had when I was injured, is nobody would come and see me in the hospital. And then all of a sudden here's everybody at the hospital trying to console and support. And for me, Brian, I just had a sense of peace from the very beginning. I don't think I wavered emotionally at all for a couple of weeks, really. I just felt like I was going to be taken care of. Things were going to be okay. I knew where he was at, and my whole goal was to take care of my daughter, who had no idea that she just lost her father. And how do I get through a child that is going to be going through some pretty big experiences her senior year? This is where we're at this year, that she would no longer have her father for that. And so for myself personally, I was in a place of peace and calm, and I had been down this walk hundreds of times before. I had a social support system that spanned the entire United States. I had a unique perspective in doing death work for so many years. And so for me, even though it was the loss of my husband, it was different in a way. And I think so many people did not know how to deal with that, They
Just hit so close to home.
Yeah, and I think the reaction that they expected me to have was to be on the floor or
Yeah.
to not be functional, and that's not at all where I found myself to be.
Mhm.
Um, and so, a caveat to that, though, is that just a few months, maybe like a month and a half after John retired from the Houston Fire Department, he had been diagnosed with a disorder that would have eventually led to Parkinson's. And Parkinson's runs in his family, and Parkinson's in his family included an element of dementia. And so he started showing signs of the neural pathways that were starting to degrade, that were showing up in his sleep at nighttime. And so the physicians had said, we don't know when it's coming. We don't know if it's 6 months, 6 years, 16 years. You may not, but this is what this disorder eventually leads to. And because it was a family history, we knew it was probably coming pretty quick. And so the blessing in the cardiac piece is that nobody has to suffer through the integrity and the dignity that gets taken away from Parkinson's and dementia. And so for me, it was a relief that none of us had to go through that, but especially him, because being a leader, being a commander, being a firefighter, and all
Yeah.
that entails, being a male, and losing all of that
It's
is
hard. Yeah.
devastating. And that means that he would have gone down kind of a similar path that I went down, where all of a sudden your identity is taken away from you because you can no longer do this work. And so I truly believe that he was spared from that heartache and that loss, and that loss of dignity that really comes with a male body breaking down and not being able to do this work of rescuing
Yeah.
and whatnot. And
And
so
everything he did his whole life.
his whole entire life. And I almost believe in a way that because of our faith and our belief in God and knowing where we're going to be, is that it's almost more painful to go through identity loss than it is to actually go through a death loss for me. And I think that that would have been incredibly difficult for him to go through as well, just knowing his personality
Yeah.
and
Knowing
whatnot.
what kind of person he was.
Yeah, and so that was a big part of how I was able to handle things differently than most people per se.
Hmm.
So I come to this loss from many different perspectives that are very unique, that a lot of people aren't afforded. And so it gives me a greater understanding, though, of how I can take care of families that come into our fold. And we've had some since John's death that we've brought in. And now I understand even to a depth of more knowledge, like going back to when the first episode when I was joking about, or maybe it was this episode where I was joking about having a PhD in this stuff.
Hmm. Yeah.
I knew nothing. I had no idea what I was talking about. I did to a certain extent, but it was all clinical. It was all
Yeah.
what I learned on paper.
Through research and studies. Yeah.
Yeah, and walking along somebody else. It was not my story, though. It was not my journey.
Hmm.
My story of loss that I had such a complicated time trying to recover from
Hmm.
was the injury standpoint, but I couldn't relate to a spouse who had lost their loved one, through death. And so now I was given that opportunity, and it's a gift to be able to now know in such a deep way what it's probably like for this next widow or child that's coming through our doors for the task force. And what better ways can I serve them through my own understanding and through my own hardships? And it's not an easy walk for sure on many different levels. Emotionally and spiritually, I think I've done pretty well, again, because of all of those things that are in place. But there's so much that entails losing a person just an everyday person, much less the complicating factors that come from a firefighter that has died in the line of duty, and what all that entails. And so there's a lot of difficulty that ensued with trying to sort all of that stuff out. And then, of course, having a child and trying to figure out, okay, what kind of support does she need? And what does that look like for her life to come? And so there's those elements that I have struggled through, and just like what I say with my injury, I wouldn't trade it for the world. Would I love to have John back? Absolutely. But would I change the experience to be something different? No, because it's something more that I can do according to the verse that I read earlier, because of the comfort that I've been given from others, the comfort that I've been given in my faith and by God, and the way that I've been able to draw closer in my relationship with Christ has allowed me to serve others better and to be able to support them in their grief. And it's opened the door for me to be able to share my story in such a way that maybe I can make a difference for firefighters and other first responders that maybe don't understand the complexities of grief and loss. And now I have a different perspective of that. So not just experiencing it from other people's stories, because I can't share their story. I can, but I can't relate to it. And I can teach from their story, but now I can teach from my own personal story itself. And what has worked for me and what has changed for me, and how can I make things better, or how can I help this firefighter or this family member walk through their own journey.
Your department needs top-notch recruitment and training videos, but you don't have the time to create them. At Bella Media, we've already helped fire departments like yours tell their story. Let us handle the videos so you can focus on saving lives. Email us at info@bellamedia.com to get started today. That's info@bellamedia.com.
What do you think some of your key takeaways were from the personal experience as it pertains to future endeavors, as far as it pertains to, the development of your mission in this world?
Well, that's such a great question, and it's kind of multifaceted, but I think one of the biggest pieces that have come out for me, and that I've seen doors open quite a bit for me this last year. Again, it's one of those things where I never expected God to open these kind of doors, but I think they're so important, is that the fire service, and coming from this, because this is all I know, I don't know the law enforcement piece. One of my best friends is a law enforcement chaplain, and she tells me her stories. But coming from the fire service experience, I do think it is unique for us, is that it's our whole world. It really can be our whole world. What I was talking about earlier, we build our identity on it. Our friends are it. We are part of it all the time. There's events that we got to go to, Santa Ride, like it just becomes everything.
It does.
And even being a first responder myself, it was still very difficult in our family and in our relationship as a husband and wife to be so wrapped up in the fire service. And it is so easy to let the fire service infiltrate your family. And it is very hard to put boundaries up because we love it so much, especially on the volunteer side. It's what we want to do. We love going out there and serving. We love the thrill of a good call, right? We love the camaraderie when we're not fighting and dysfunctional. But it can really harm a family. And so I would say, even from the leadership perspective, it gets even harder for those individuals that go into captain level positions or chief level positions, because they have to take on even more so in leading their department and ensuring that their firefighters are safe, and SOGs are being written and followed, and all the things, and dealing with the drama that comes with the politics of that position. And so we can let that bleed into our relationships and in our marriage and in our families. And we find that there's a lot of families that struggle when there's a firefighter or first responder in that family, especially ones that end up being as involved as they are because of either a leadership position or a volunteer, whatever that may look like. And so we talk a lot about the high divorce rate within the first responder community. Again, I think that's a lot through across the board, but I think for our relationship specifically, it can feel toxic because of what we bring home. And so for John and I, we struggled the last few years because he not only was working for Houston, he was trying to lead a department that had some difficult leadership issues and a lot of politics that were going on because of those leadership issues, and then wanting to have a midlife crisis and deciding he wanted to be a wildland firefighter at 54. Like, who does that? But, again, he was passionate about it. So his whole life really became the fire service and was taking away from what I thought our boundaries should have been. And I will tell you, I'm just as bad about that as well because I love the work that I do with the organization, the foundation, and teaching and all of that. And so raising a child, that has to come first. Your marriage has
Yeah,
to come first.
agreed.
And so we have to really, really be intentional in working on those relationships that we have within our family or our social structure. If you're not married, whatever your social structure looks like, and getting relationships that are outside of the fire service that pour into you and you're able to pour into them. Um, so when John died, we were at a place that wasn't our lowest for sure, but we were having a hard time because we were trying to figure out what boundaries look like being a chief and being involved in wildland and trying to build the program and right the ship of this fire department. And that was causing some difficulty for us. And so we were trying to figure that piece out. And so I think when you look at your career, your profession in this work is that you have to take some time away. You have to be able to give yourself to this other person that's in your life. Otherwise, if something like this were to happen, I've left this relationship, or when he died, there was a lot of guilt that was associated with that because there were a lot of things that were not said. There were a lot of apologies that we never got to say. There were a lot of things that we were wanting to do. Like we had just gone on a world cruise to celebrate his retirement from Houston and our daughter's 16th birthday. And that, again, was God's blessing for us because who wants to pay for Wi-Fi out in Italy? It's so expensive on a cruise ship. So we got to spend a month together, just not dealing with our work. And that was such a heaven sent thing and a blessing. And we had determined at that point when we got back that we would go into couples counseling just to figure out how to make our marriage stronger and to get through this part because we knew it was still going to be hard, but how could we make ourselves better? And we never had the opportunity to do that. And so we know that our lives are short and things happen, and it doesn't have to be on the job, but it potentially could be. But not leaving things unsaid, ensuring that the relationships that you have outside of the fire service are being tended to, that are being strengthened, that there's boundaries that we have. I think that's the biggest lesson learned for me coming out of his death that I'm trying to teach alongside of the grief piece, but also the family piece is such a big part of who we are and our identities too, is that we have that strong social support that's there. And that's such an important part of who we are.
Completely agree. Absolutely. Yeah, one of the I did a speech a while back for in a graduating fire
Mm-hmm.
academy, and the I talked to him about priorities,
Mm-hmm.
and it was faith first,
Mm-hmm.
family second,
Yeah.
fire third. And I'm a huge proponent of that
Yeah.
particular priority level just because it's, you've got to have things in a specific order in order for things
Yeah.
to work out well. So I completely agree with you.
And that can be hard for our career firefighters when you're short staffed and you're having to do mandatory overtime and things like that. But
Yeah.
there are ways that you can really try to work in those boundary issues and building intentional time in. It really is intentionality. And so I would say what comes out of my story and his loss and in the work that I've done and continue to do is the intentionality piece, taking the intention of strengthening your family, the intention of doing the best that you can, the intention of taking care of yourself because the work does affect us. And when we got John's autopsy report back, and thankfully, um, we don't see a lot of autopsies on cardiac deaths because usually they go straight to the funeral home when we talk about firefighters.
Mhm.
Um, I was able to see inside of what it actually looks like. We talk about how much the stress impacts our bodies, and he was absolutely the picture of that. His whole cardiovascular system was torn up from the brain all the way down to his kidneys. And how he survived on one small low dose blood pressure medication and still run circles around him, I don't know. But I think we become used to that. And so it's true that our work puts this stressor on us. And so we have to be intentional in our care, intentional on how we physically exert ourselves and making ourselves stronger. So it's intentionality in all aspects of our lives, spiritually, physically, mentally, relationally, all of that is so important that we come out the healthiest we can.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Uh, I'm just speechless
Oh.
of how this all worked out for you in the long run. But I do truly believe that it was a hard road
Mhm.
for you. But I think even though it was, you're
Mhm.
doing great things with
Thank
it.
you.
So we really appreciate everything that you do, and you're so strong for
Thank you.
having such a long career
Yeah.
and then this.
Right. Yeah.
So I hope that you're continuing to get that support.
Absolutely.
That's
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, for sure. And I also want to leave this too is that when we do go through adversity, I think a big part of what helps us recover and rebuild and heal is finding that purpose and making that meaning and creating that legacy for that individual. If it's a person that you lost, trying to figure out what is the meaning behind this, what can I do in order to propel that person's story forward. And that's the legacy building piece and building legacy. And that may look very different. And I tell my guys this, that one of the firefighters that he mentored very closely, his legacy building and making meaning out of John's death is maybe he continues on the training aspect because John was such a big trainer.
Hmm.
Maybe for somebody else it is family care. For me, it's something different. And so making meaning and finding legacy and being intentional is all part of the key aspect, along with your faith, of course, in being able to rebuild and recover in a way that is glorifying to God's mission and what we're here to do and what He's placed us on this earth to do.
Hmm. I completely agree. And I think there's a lot to be said for that too, from through some of these mental health aspects that the
Hmm.
world's talking about, that it's hard to really address somebody's emotional needs and their true mental health without being willing to discuss faith and
Yes.
have, because that is foundationally who some people are, who a
Yeah.
lot of people are.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. We have a moral compass and we have ethics and,
mm,
we have belief systems and we have to be able to talk about those things too and how they integrate with our work. So it plays a big part. Spirituality is huge.
yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
Well, thank you so much for
You're
being here
welcome.
today. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you sharing that story.
Sure.
I know it's probably difficult to go through, but
Mm.
I can promise you that it's going to get out there, and it's going to help some people
Good.
to
Thank you.
understand kind of how that happened, and
Sure.
hopefully it helps other people heal too.
Absolutely. Thank you for
So,
having me on and let me share my story.
you bet. No problem. Anytime. We'll have you back.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks.
Command, Engine 10. First line attack, making entry.